bookworms, I'm Addison Bray, your junior Miss Tennessee Cosmos, and happy Memorial Day. Now, Memorial Day is a day that we honor the men and women who fought and died while in service to our country. Today we are going to be reading about a very influential woman who made a great impact in our country. And today we are going to be reading about Betsy Ross. Who was Betsy Ross? In the spring of 1764, a young girl in Philadelphia named Elizabeth Griscom visited her sister at work. Elizabeth's sister was a seamstress for an upholstery business, produced many items made out of fabric, including curtains, tablecloths, quilts, sheets, and even cloth-covered furniture. The workers were kept very busy creating items to decorate some of the most important homes in the American colonies of Great Britain. Elizabeth, who was known as Betsy, was still in school. Her older sisters were working to help her large family. Betsy knew she would one day join them at the shop. The morning that Betsy visited the workshop, one of the seamstresses had a problem with a piece of fabric. Betsy was pretty good at sewing. She took a quick look at the problem and was able to fix it quickly. John Webster, the owner of the business, saw this and was impressed. Betsy was only 12, but she could sew better than some of the older girls. Webster visited Betsy's mother and asked if Betsy could come work at the shop too. Mrs. Griscom said yes. A few days later, Betsy's life at school ended, and her life as a seamstress began. Betsy's quick stitching that day was the beginning of a sewing career that lasted almost 70 years. Over time, a legend grew that Betsy herself had sewn something very famous, the first United States flag. That story may or may not be true, but one thing is certain: Betsy Ross and thousands of hard-working women like her helped support the cause of the colonial army and the fight for America's independence. Chapter 1. A Quaker Girl. The winter of 1752 was one of the worst Philadelphia had seen. Food was scarce and the snow was deep. The terrible cold froze animals as they stood in the fields. In a cabin just outside the city, Betsy Griscom was born on January 1st. She joined the large family of Samuel and Rebecca Griscom. Samuel worked in Philadelphia as a carpenter, as his father and grandfather had done. Samuel built homes and furniture for the growing city. Philadelphia was the largest city in Pennsylvania, one of 13 colonies in America owned by Great Britain. It was also the largest city in all the American colonies. People had been coming to America from England for more than 100 years. In England, they could not always worship how they wanted to. They came to the colonies so that they could follow their own religious traditions. Samuel and Rebecca's parents had made that trip across the Atlantic Ocean. The Griscoms were members of the Society of Friends, a Christian group also known as Quakers. The Quakers believed in a simple life. They wanted to work, worship, and raise their families. Twice a week, Betsy went to Quaker services with her family. At home, Betsy helped her mother and sisters with many chores, including stacking firewood, sweeping the rooms, and washing dishes. Quaker children wore very plain clothing. Betsy wore long, dark dresses, usually with long sleeves, as she always wore a bonnet on her head. The older girls sometimes wore mob caps instead, which looked like small mushrooms. When Betsy was born, the Griscoms already had 5 daughters: Deborah, Susanna, Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary. 2 other Griscom children had died while infants. Betsy was the 8th child. In time, Betsy's parents would go on to have 5 more daughters and 4 sons, all but one of whom died very young. In all, only 8 of the Griscoms' 17 children survived infancy and grew up to be adults. When Betsy was just a few years old, Samuel moved his family into the bustling city of Philadelphia. He built a large home with 11 rooms for his growing family. Like most religions of the time, Quakers believed both girls and boys should be educated. When Betsy was about 6, she started school. She went to a Quaker school run by a teacher named Rebecca Jones. The students learned to read and do arithmetic. They went to class 5 days a week, and then again on Saturday mornings. Along with their regular lessons, the girls learned how to sew and make clothing. In the 1700s, most families made their own clothing. Betsy learned even more about sewing from her great-aunt Griscom, who owned her own business making women's corsets. Chapter 2, Time to Go to Work. Betsy's older sisters all had begun working when they were teenagers. In the early days of the American colonies, upholsterers made curtains, bed covers, cushions, and pillows. They even made furniture such as sofas and comfortable chairs. Some upholsterers also made flags. At this time, Philadelphia was a great place to be an upholsterer. Many of the rich people in the colonies lived there. They had money to spend and they wanted their homes to be beautiful. They ordered fancy chairs, beautiful tablecloths, and sofas covered with soft velvet imported from Europe. Some of the workers at John Webster's shop made nothing but fringe and tassels to decorate curtains. The expert craftspeople stitched and sewed for hours to make the finest home furnishings. Mr. Webster had many helpers. Some were paid workers who had studied and worked their way into a full-time job. Others were apprentices. An apprentice is a person who is learning on the job. They were usually not paid much, if anything, but they hoped to learn enough to one day earn a full-time job. In 1764, when Betsy was 12, she visited her sister at Mr. Webster's shop. When Webster saw Betsy's skill, he signed her on as an apprentice. In those days, it was not unusual for children to work outside their homes. Other girls worked in similar shops or in kitchens as a housemaid. Boys were trained to be printers, carpenters, or sign painters, or to care for horses and carriages. Betsy worked 6 days a week. She gathered the materials the workers needed, including fabric, needles, and thread. Sometimes she made deliveries to customers. She became a better seamstress. She had a busy life in a busy city. In 1765, Great Britain passed a new tax on its American colonies. This was nothing new, as the colonists were all British subjects and expected to be loyal to King George III, but this new tax made many colonists angry. The Stamp Act said that every piece of paper had to have a special stamp on it. Those stamps cost the colonists money. The money was sent back to England to support the king and the British Army. Americans in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston held meetings and protests against the new taxes. Ordinary citizens like Betsy started paying attention to the speeches, arguing against Great Britain's rules. In the end, Britain canceled the Stamp Act, but the American colonists were growing tired of sending more and more tax money to Great Britain. Over the next several years, Betsy continued working hard for Mr. Webster. Tension grew between the American colonists and England grew worse. But by 1773, Betsy was not paying as much attention to the politics of her country. She had fallen in love with another shop worker named John Ross. There was only one problem. John Ross was not a Quaker. Chapter 3, War. The Society of Friends did not allow its members to marry people who were not Quakers. They wanted their community to stick together. John was successful. He had opened his own upholstery shop, and he came from a good family. But instead of the Society of Friends, John went to the Church of England. Because of that, Betsy's parents were against her marriage to John. Betsy and Ross eloped. They crossed the Delaware River to nearby Gloucester, New Jersey. On November 4th, 1773, beside a large wood fireplace at an inn called Hugg's Tavern, they became man and wife. After her marriage, Betsy was forced to leave the Quakers. They asked her twice to apologize for marrying Ross, but she refused. She was not going to say she was sorry that she fell in love. Betsy joined John's church, Christ Church on 2nd Street in Philadelphia. She left Mr. Webster's shop and began working alongside John. Betsy and John started their married life at a very exciting time in Philadelphia. The anger in America over the tea tax and other insults were growing. Citizens wanted to band together to force a change. In the summer of 1774, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia. They came from the other colonies to plan their next move. In fact, these men wanted America to split from Great Britain and form an independent country. To take these steps toward its independence, they met at the Continental Congress. It was the first time that leaders from each colony had come together to discuss their dreams for a new nation. The Congress sent a letter to King George demanding the right to life, liberty, and property. King George ignored it. Many people realized that the only way America could break away from British rule would be to fight. In Philadelphia and many other cities, men began gathering weapons and training to fight. John Ross was among them. Ross and men like him became known as Minutemen. They were regular citizens who had not been part of a formal army, but they trained after work so that they could be ready in a minute, if called to action. Most were young men. Every small village or settlement had its own unit of Minutemen. The Minutemen soon had to put down their rakes and aprons and pick up their guns. The American Revolutionary War began on April 19, 1775 in Lexington, Massachusetts. The Minutemen had clashed with British troops on a road just outside of Boston. British soldiers were not in Philadelphia yet, but everyone knew they were coming. Betsy and John worried, but they had to keep working. They made chairs and curtains, they sewed tablecloths for a wedding, but after work each day, John trained with the Minutemen. And early in 1776, John was badly injured. No one is really sure what happened. He may have been hurt by exploding gunpowder that blew up while he was on guard duty. Another version of events says simply that he was hurt while training. It is certain that John died of his injuries, and on January 21st, 1776, he was buried in Philadelphia. Betsy Ross was just 24 years old. In the middle of a war, separated from her faith and her family, she was now a widow too. Chapter 4, A New Flag. To pay off money that John owed when he died, Betsy had to close his shop. Several months later, she bravely opened one of her own. It would not be easy to run a business alone. She had to find new customers, pay the bills, and order supplies. She had to do all the sewing work herself. But Betsy had watched her great aunt Sarah run her business, so she thought she could do it too. The war turned out to be good news for Betsy's business. As people in Philadelphia prepared to fight, they needed the very thing she was good at making. Soldiers needed blankets and bedding, armies needed cots and tents, and everyone needed flags. Each unit of the growing colonial army required its own flag. Each colony had its own flag too. Even ships flew flags. They were all different, each to be made by hand. Betsy's skills were perfect for this job. Flags had to look great, but they also had to stay sturdy to wave in any weather. In the spring of 1776, there was not one flag to represent all the colonies. Several different flags had been used by American troops in battle. Most had taken parts of the British flag, which was red, white, and blue. Some of the leaders of the colonies wanted what they were starting to call the United States to have a flag all its own, one that everyone could rally behind. There's a great American legend that Betsy Ross sewed the very first American flag. Is it true? Her family says so. It's a story that's become a part of the country's early history. Nearly 100 years after the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Betsy's family told this story. 3 men visited Betsy at her Philadelphia shop. One was George Ross, John's uncle. He knew Betsy and was aware of her skill at sewing. George Ross had been part of the First Continental Congress and a leader in the colonies. The second man was another colonial leader, Robert Morris. He was a very rich man who helped raise money to pay for the colonists' fight. The third man, according to the story, was George Washington. In 1776, Washington was the leader of the new Continental Army. When they visited Betsy's shop, the 3 men brought a sketch of a flag. They needed to have a sample made. Betsy showed them a few ways to make it better. The men had drawn a square flag. Betsy told them that the flag should be longer. Their sketch showed 13 red and white stripes. There was 1 stripe for each of the 13 colonies. Betsy showed them how she could sew those stripes together. A blue square in the upper left corner had stars. The stars each had 6 points. Betsy looked at the stars and realized she had a better way. She folded a piece of paper 8 times, made 1 snip with her scissors, and showed the man a 5-pointed star. Betsy said that making stars this way would be faster and easier. Washington and the other men liked what she had showed them. They left Betsy with some money to buy fabric, and they asked her to make a sample of this new flag to show Congress. While Betsy worked on her flag, the Continental Congress was debating the terms of the Declaration of Independence. The leaders of the colonies said that no nation should rule another. They wrote that all men are created equal, and that no one could take away their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration listed the many things that King George and Great Britain had done to the colonies. It ended by declaring that the colonies are free and independent states. The Declaration was approved on July 4th, 1776, which is now known as Independence Day. Copies were carried throughout the colonies and read to bigger and bigger crowds of people. 4 days later, Betsy was probably among the thousands who heard it read out loud on the streets of Philadelphia. A year later, on June 14, 1777, Congress passed a law that the flag of the United States would look like the one described in the story about Betsy Ross. But did she really sew that first flag? Historians have found no evidence to support the family's story, although there is no concrete proof. Betsy did spend many of the rest of her years making flags, many of which were indeed the Stars and Stripes. Chapter 5, A Hometown Invaded. By the winter of 1776, the Continental Army had lost battles in New York and retreated south into New Jersey. Unless the battling colonists could stop the British, Philadelphia would soon be under attack as well. General Washington came up with a daring plan. He knew that Hessians, German troops hired by Britain, were camping near Trenton, New Jersey. Many people believed that they would soon head to Philadelphia. On December 26, 1776, Washington gathered some of his troops near McConkley's Ferry, Pennsylvania. This site is known today as Washington's Crossing. Quietly climbing into boats, they sneaked across the icy Delaware River at night. They arrived at the Hessians' camp during a Christmas party and quickly defeated them. Washington and his men went on to win an important battle at Princeton, New Jersey. They camped through the winter in Morristown, New Jersey, about 80 miles to the north of Philadelphia, but the war was still moving closer to that key city. Back in Philadelphia, Betsy's life was changing again. She had met a sailor named Joseph Ashburn. On June 15, 1777, Betsy Ross became Betsy Ashburn when the pair married at the Old Swedes Church in Philadelphia. Betsy continued to be busy at work. That spring she was paid 14 pounds and 12 shillings, about $2,600 today, for Pennsylvania ships' flags known as colors. One of these flags was flown aboard a ship called the Hetty. Joseph had joined the ship's crew not long after their wedding. Just 3 weeks after Ashburn married Betsy, his ship headed out as part of the young American Navy. One of the first battles he fought was near Brandywine Creek, just west of Philadelphia. The colonial troops lost the Battle of Brandywine. That opened the way for British troops to move towards and capture Philadelphia. Thousands of citizens fled to the countryside in safety. Betsy decided to stay. She had a business to run. On September 26, 1777, led by Lord Cornwallis and General William Howe, the British advanced into the city. Row after row of red-coated soldiers marched through the streets as Betsy and her neighbors looked on. The army band played, but no one sang along. The soldiers moved into the city's buildings and filled city parks. The officers took control of the fancy homes of some of the wealthier residents. The British even camped in the same building where Congress had met. They tore out walls to make the first floor into housing for troops. They put beds on the second floor to care for wounded American prisoners. A week later, Washington tried to attack British forces staying outside the city near Germantown, but the colonial army was beaten back. Wounded soldiers from both sides were carried the 6 miles back to Philadelphia. Betsy was among the many women who helped take care of the men. They rolled bandages and sewed slings and blankets. Not long after this defeat, Washington made camp for the winter and spring at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. For 7 months, his troops suffered there with little food or shelter. Even though Philadelphia was only 20 miles away, British troops blocked any help from reaching Washington and his men. Betsy and other patriots made clothing and tents for the men. The clothes, food, and other supplies were sneaked out of the city and quietly transported to the starving soldiers. During this time, Betsy did not know where her new husband was. His ship had not come back to Philadelphia yet. There was no way for him to get word to her. She did not even know if he was alive. Chapter 6, Victory and a New Life. By the spring of 1778, the British had left Philadelphia. Part of their army headed out to attack colonies to the south. The rest of the British moved on to New York City, where the fighting was fierce. In Philadelphia, they left behind a huge mess. Many buildings were ruined, many of the Most of the food in the city was gone, and the ships in the port had been burned. The British Army had taken furniture, horses, and wagons. Thousands of Pennsylvania residents left with the British, choosing to side with England over the new nation of America. Betsy and her neighbors lived and worked in a city where it became harder and harder to survive. Amid all the chaos, Joseph Ashburn returned safely from his latest voyage. While he and other men worked hard to clean up the mess the British had left behind, Betsy kept sewing. Along with flags, she sewed military supplies for the Continental Army. Colonial soldiers used long-barreled guns called muskets. To load one, a soldier poured gunpowder down the barrel. Then he stuffed a lead ball in after. Soldiers carried the powder and the balls in small bags called cartridges. Betsy and other women sewed thousands of canvas cartridges. Betsy and Joseph's first child, a daughter named Auxilia, was born on September 15, 1779. Food was still scarce in the city. People were burning furniture to keep warm. Sadly, Auxilia got sick and died when she was less than a year old. In 1781, the couple had a second daughter, Eliza. Later that same year, Joseph set sail on the Lion, which went all the way to Europe chasing British ships. The Lion was captured and Joseph was put in a British prison called the Old Mill. The Old Mill prison was a terrible place with too many men packed into too little space. Prisoners actually sold their clothes to buy bread to eat. Disease spread quickly among the men. Joseph was among the hundreds of men who died there. Betsy Ross Ashburn was a widow once again. She heard the news about her husband's death weeks later from an old friend. John Claypool had known Betsy since they were children. He later became a soldier and had ended up as a prisoner in the Old Mill along with Joseph Ashburn. As a friend, he wanted to give Betsy the sad news in person. When he made it back to Philadelphia, he visited her straight away. Losing yet another husband was very sad, but Betsy had some reasons to be happy. Her daughter Eliza was healthy. She was busy with her work, and the American Revolution had ended. After a series of battles in 1780 and 1781, Washington's forces trapped the British on a peninsula in Yorktown, Virginia. French ships joined the fight and prevented British ships from rescuing their soldiers. Stuck in this trap, British General Cornwallis surrendered his army to Washington in October 1781. The Americans had won! 2 years later, Betsy's old friend, John Claypool, asked her to be his wife. They were married on May 8, 1783. Betsy had a new husband and a new partner in the upholstery and flag-making business. John left the sea to help make their business grow. Chapter 7. The Claypools Move Ahead. During the war, people in the Society of Friends had a difficult time. They wanted to support their neighbors, but they were against war or fighting of any kind. They did not serve in the army for either the British or the American colonies. Some of these Quakers, however, did want to fight and support the cause of freedom. During the war, they chose to leave the main body of the society and formed the Free Quakers. The new group stuck to their beliefs of plain talk and dress, and of course, looking to their inner light. However, they also saw that sometimes fighting for what was right was okay. After marrying, Betsy and John joined this new group. They began attending services in a building the group had built in 1783. Betsy was able to return to her Quaker roots and to the services she had grown up with. While Betsy was returning to her Quaker family, she and John was starting their own. In 1785, their first daughter, Clarissa, was born. She was joined a year later by Susan. The Claypools continued to work together in their shop, moving to a larger home in 1787. They needed the room by then, and then they had 2 more daughters, Rachel and Jane. Betsy's life was busy with work and 5 daughters to care for. At the shop, business was good. Along with flags and home furnishings, they made furniture for ships. John knew exactly what types of things ships needed, and he was able to bring in more customers. In fact, the shop did well enough that John and Betsy could afford to buy a horse and carriage by 1786. When he was not working, John spent time helping others. The Quakers had always believed in anti-slavery. Inspired by his Quaker beliefs, John worked with groups that tried to free slaves and aid prisoners. These new groups sought to make sure free black people remained free and were not kidnapped back into slavery. They visited jails and demanded fair and healthy treatment for the prisoners. By 1793, Betsy and John had a fine family, a good home, and steady work. But in the summer of that year, a tragic epidemic spread throughout Philadelphia. Yellow fever struck and thousands of people died from the disease. Betsy's parents died early in the epidemic. Betsy's sister Deborah died too. Her sister Mary died soon after, also possibly from the fever. The yellow fever epidemic was over by early 1794. That year, John found another job. He went to work for the new United States government as a customs inspector. His job was to check the imported items brought to Philadelphia on ships. Betsy continued running their shop, which was making furniture for the new government buildings. Philadelphia had been chosen as the capital of the young United States, though the capital would later move to New York City and then Washington, D.C. Experts such as Betsy made cushions, pillows, wall coverings, curtains, and more. Congress met in Philadelphia, and George Washington, the leader of the Continental Army, had been elected as the first president of the new nation. His office was in Philadelphia, too. The city became the center of activity for those who took on the difficult work of turning 13 colonies into a united nation. With their success, Betsy and John Claypool could afford a grander lifestyle. The Claypool's daughters attended a private school. They went to fancy parties. At one of them, Betsy's niece, Margaret, danced with President Washington himself. Betsy Griscom Ross Ashburn Claypool had come a long way from struggling to find food during the cold winters of war. Chapter 8, Busy to the End. The end of the 1700s was the time for more change for America, and for Betsy and her family in 1795, she and John had another baby, Harriet, but the baby died 10 months later. In 1799, Eliza Ashburn, Betsy's oldest daughter, married a ship's captain, and later that year, George Washington passed away at the age of 67. Washington's death saddened the entire nation that he had helped create. In Philadelphia, numerous public services and funerals were held to honor him. Betsy and her family took part, joining thousands of citizens. In 1800, John Claypool suffered what was probably a stroke. He could no longer work. He stayed home and usually in bed for the rest of his life. Betsy did her best to care for him, but it was not as easy. By 1803, they were receiving money as charity from the Free Quakers to help pay their bills. Betsy kept working. Her daughters helped as much as they could, but one by one they married and started their own families. Betsy enjoyed being grandmother. One of Clarissa's twins was named for her. Betsy continued making flags. The short war of 1812 between America and Great Britain led to more orders from the U.S. Army and Navy. In 1817, John Claypool died at home. Betsy had worked hard to care for him, even as she grew old herself. For the third time in her life, Betsy was a widow. 10 years later, at age 75, Betsy finally stopped working. Her daughter Clarissa and Margaret, Betsy's niece, took over the shop. Betsy left Philadelphia to live with her daughter Susan in the countryside of Abington, Pennsylvania. She made regular trips back to the city to go to Free Quaker meetings and to see old friends. Philadelphia continued to grow. When Betsy was born, about 25,000 people lived there. By the 1830 census, Philadelphia was home to more than 80,000. In July 1835, America turned 59 years old. As always, on Independence Day, U.S. flags flew everywhere. That year, there were 24 stars on the flag. In 1835, Betsy moved back to Philadelphia to live with her daughter Jane. On January 30th, 1836, when she was 84 years old, Betsy Ross passed away. Jane's son, William Canby, remembered that when she died, she was beloved and respected by all who had ever known her. Chapter 9, A Legend is Born. The story of Betsy Ross might have ended with her death in 1863 if not for William Canby. William was Betsy's grandson. In 1870, he gave a speech in Philadelphia to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. William had gathered memories of Betsy from his family to share with the group. In his speech, Canby said that Betsy Ross had made the first U.S. flag. This lady is the one to whom belongs the honor of having made with her own hands the first flag, Canby said. He said that Betsy's daughter remembered hearing the stories from their mother. He had even spoken to Betsy's niece, Margaret. Canby's story caught the public's attention. Not long after, in 1876, America celebrated its 100th birthday. Patriotic speeches like Canby's were widely repeated. People were very interested in the details of how the United States had gained its independence. The story of the first flag was soon told all over the country. In the 1890s, the story of Betsy Ross was so popular that the city of Philadelphia wanted to create a way to remember her. One of the houses that she might have lived in was still standing. It became a tourist attraction. The people who lived there hung a sign that said, "First flag of the U.S. made in this house." In 1898, it was established as the American Flag House. The house became a museum dedicated to the life of Betsy Ross and the story of Philadelphia. In the years since Canby's speech, historians have tried to learn more about Betsy Ross. They have found no direct evidence that she did in fact sew the first flag. Washington's papers do not mention her. Congressional records do not mention her. Historians require more proof than stories and memories. However, Betsy was part of an amazing time in American history. The story of her life, her work, and her family remains true, even if the reason she is famous may not be. Today, more than 250,000 people visit the Betsy Ross House in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania each year. It is located a few blocks from Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell, and it remains one of the most visited sites in the city. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, bookworms, and have a great rest of your Memorial Day. Bye!